At 3:16 in the afternoon on July 19, 1989, a sound came from the tail of United Airlines Flight 232 that every person on board heard simultaneously. It wasn't a crack. It wasn't a bang. Survivors described it differently: a cannon shot, a bomb, a sound so deep and so total that they felt it in their chest before they heard it with their ears. The aircraft shuddered violently. Overhead bins burst open. Drinks flew from tray tables. A flight attendant in the rear galley was thrown off her feet. Then the sound stopped, and the silence that replaced it was, in its own way, worse. In the cockpit, Captain Alfred C. Haynes reached for the controls. He had been flying commercial aircraft for 33 years. He had accumulated 29,967 total flight hours. He had been a Marine Corps pilot before that. He had encountered turbulence, engine failures, electrical faults, hydraulic problems, the full catalog of things that can go wrong on a commercial aircraft at altitude. He had handled every one of them. He had always found the controls where he expected them to be. He pushed on the control column. Nothing happened. He tried the rudder pedals. Nothing. First Officer Bill Records, in the right seat, tried his controls simultaneously. The same nothing. In 33 years of flying, Al Haynes had never experienced anything like what he was experiencing now. The aircraft was not responding. Not sluggish, not stiff, simply not there. The connection between his hands and the airplane had been severed completely. Flight 232, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 carrying 285 passengers and 11 crew members from Denver to Chicago, was at 37,000 feet over Iowa. Both pilots had just discovered that they could not fly it. What happened in the next 41 minutes is the reason aviation professionals still study this flight more than 3 decades later. It is the reason that a specific technique for controlling an aircraft without hydraulics exists in emergency manuals around the world today. It is the reason that 185 people who should have died are alive. And it begins as all aviation disasters begin, not in the sky, but years earlier in a factory with something so small that it was invisible to the naked eye. Let me tell you about the fan disc, because without understanding what it was and what it did, you cannot understand what happened when it failed. The engine at the tail of the DC-10, engine number 2, the center engine mounted at the base of the vertical tail fin, was a General Electric CF6-6 turbofan. Inside that engine, at the front, sat a component called the Stage 1 fan disc. It was a large circular piece of titanium alloy, about the size of a dining room table if you unrolled it flat, weighing hundreds of pounds. Attached to its rim were the fan blades that pulled air into the engine. The disc rotated at thousands of revolutions per minute. Everything downstream, the compression, the combustion, the thrust, depended on it staying in one piece. The fan disc on engine number 2 of Flight 232 had been manufactured by General Electric in 1971, 18 years before the accident. When it came off the production line, it contained a defect that no one could see. Deep inside the titanium, in a region that inspectors never had reason to examine closely, there was a microscopic pocket of nitrogen-contaminated material, what metallurgists call a hard alpha inclusion. This type of defect occurs during the manufacturing process when nitrogen contaminates the molten titanium before it solidifies. The resulting material is harder and more brittle than the surrounding metal. In the right conditions, under enough repeated stress, it cracks. The fan disc had been rotating at high speed on every single flight since 1971. Each rotation was a stress cycle. Each cycle propagated the crack slightly further from that original inclusion. Over 18 years and tens of thousands of flight cycles, the crack grew. Slowly, invisibly, completely undetected through every inspection the disc had ever received. Because the inspection procedures at the time were not designed to find this type of internal defect at this location. On July 19, 1989, on a warm afternoon over Iowa, the crack reached the point where the titanium could no longer hold itself together. The fan disc shattered. Let me tell you about what happened in the next 3 seconds, because 3 seconds was all it took to turn a routine flight into the most extraordinary survival story in commercial aviation history. When a fan disc failed, it didn't simply break apart and fall. It exploded. The fragments, some the size of dinner plates, some smaller, all moving at velocities exceeding the speed of sound, tore through the engine casing and flew outward in every direction. The engine nacelle, which was designed to contain an ordinary engine failure, was not designed to contain the catastrophic disintegration of its own rotating components. Metal fragments penetrated the tail section of the aircraft in multiple locations. They punched through the horizontal stabilizer. They tore through the fuselage skin. And in 3 specific locations, they cut through something that no one had anticipated all 3 could ever be cut simultaneously. The hydraulic lines. The DC-10 had 3 completely independent hydraulic systems. System 1, System 2, System 3. They were separated physically, routed through different parts of the aircraft, designed specifically so that no single event could disable all 3. The engineers who designed the DC-10 calculated the probability of losing all 3 systems simultaneously as approximately 1 in a billion. They were right about the math, but they had made an assumption that turned out to be wrong, that multiple failures would always have independent causes. The fan disc fragments didn't care about probability calculations. They flew outward in a pattern that happened, in a 1 in a billion coincidence that actually occurred, to sever all 3 hydraulic lines. The hydraulic fluid that operated every single flight control in the DC-10, the ailerons that controlled banking, the elevators that controlled pitch, the rudder that controlled yaw, the spoilers, the flaps, the slats began pouring out of the aircraft at altitude. Within seconds, it was gone. Captain Haynes and First Officer Records now sat at the controls of an aircraft that had no flight controls. None. The yoke moved freely in their hands, connected to nothing. The rudder pedals traveled uselessly. The autopilot had disengaged. It couldn't operate without hydraulic power either. The DC-10 was at 37,000 feet, descending, beginning to drift into a right-hand turn, and responding to nothing the pilots did. This situation, total hydraulic failure on a commercial aircraft, had never been successfully survived before. It had never been successfully simulated. The aircraft was, by every engineering parameter, unflyable. Let me tell you about Al Haynes, because this is where the man became something more than a pilot. Captain Alfred Haynes was 57 years old. He had grown up in Texas, joined the Marine Corps, learned to fly in an era when flying still meant pulling on physical control cables and feeling the aircraft through your hands. He had transitioned through propeller aircraft, early jets, and eventually the DC-10. He was, by every measure, a pilot's pilot, the kind of man other pilots trusted with their lives without thinking about it. When Haynes discovered that the controls were unresponsive, he did not freeze. He did not panic. He did something that the NTSB investigators, reviewing the cockpit voice recorder transcript months later, would describe as the foundational decision of the entire emergency. He reduced thrust on the left engine. The aircraft responded, not with precision, with a crude, rolling, barely perceptible change in attitude. But it responded. This was the discovery. Without hydraulics, without flight control surfaces, the DC-10 could still be influenced. Not steered, not flown in any conventional sense, but influenced by adjusting the thrust on the 2 remaining wing engines asymmetrically. More power on the right engine than the left would eventually nudge the aircraft left. More on the left than the right, and it would drift right. Both engines together, more thrust meant less descent, less thrust meant more. It was not flying. It was more like trying to steer a boat with no rudder by shifting your weight from side to side. The aircraft had its own agenda, a pronounced tendency to turn right and to oscillate up and down in a slow, rhythmic cycle called a phugoid. Every input the crew made was imprecise, delayed, and unpredictable. But it was something. In a situation where the aviation textbooks said there was nothing to be done, Al Haynes had found something. For minutes after the explosion, at 3:20 in the afternoon, Flight 232 called Minneapolis Air Traffic Control and declared an emergency. The controller who took that call, Kevin Bachman, would later say that in his years of handling aircraft emergencies, he had never heard anything like what Haynes described with quiet, professional precision. total loss of all flight controls, attempting to maintain some control through engine thrust, requesting vectors to the nearest suitable airport. Bachmann began working the problem. Let me tell you about Dennis Fitch, because he is the reason any of this worked. Dennis Fitch was 46 years old and was riding as a passenger in the first-class cabin of Flight 232. He was a DC-10 training captain for United Airlines, the kind of pilot whose job was to sit in simulators with other pilots and practice emergencies. He had spent years thinking carefully about the DC-10 systems, its failure modes, its capabilities and limitations. When he felt the explosion and watched the flight attendants' expressions change, he understood immediately that something serious had happened. When the seatbelt signs came on and the aircraft began its strange, drifting behavior, he understood that it was something very serious. He made his way to the forward galley and told a flight attendant who he was. He asked if the captain needed help. For minutes later, he was in the cockpit. What Haynes did next was, investigators later said, as important as any other single decision made that afternoon. He could have thanked Fitch, acknowledged his expertise, and asked him to stand in the jump seat and observe. That would have been reasonable. That would have been the conventional response of a captain protecting his authority and his cockpit. Instead, Haynes looked at Fitch and said, "Denny, I'll tell you what, you have the throttles." He handed control of the aircraft's only steering system to a man who had walked in off the passenger cabin 60 seconds earlier. Because Al Haynes understood something that not every captain would have understood. That having Fitch operate the throttles while Haynes and Records worked the other systems would give the aircraft its best chance. Not his best chance, the aircraft's best chance. There was a difference, and in that difference was the CRM principle, crew resource management. That Flight 232 would later become the most famous case study for in the history of aviation training. Let me tell you about the 41 minutes that followed, because they were 41 minutes that no one on board knew they would survive. Fitch positioned himself in the cockpit between the two pilot seats and took the throttles, the two levers controlling engine 1 on the left wing and engine 3 on the right wing. He began to work them. What he discovered in the first few minutes confirmed what Haynes had found. The aircraft could be influenced, but it could not be controlled. Every input was approximate. The aircraft's tendency to turn right was relentless. Fighting it required constantly running the right engine at higher thrust than the left, which meant the aircraft was always being pulled in two directions simultaneously. Fitch would later describe the experience as trying to fly an aircraft with rubber bands instead of cables. The feedback was slow, indirect, and never quite proportional to the input. When he pushed the right throttle forward, the aircraft didn't turn left immediately. It took 8, 10, 12 seconds to respond, and by then the situation had changed and the input was wrong. He was always correcting for something that had already happened. Meanwhile, in the cabin, flight attendants were preparing 285 passengers for an emergency landing. The senior flight attendant, Jan Brown, was coordinating the brace position instructions, moving through the cabin, managing the reality of telling people that the aircraft had a serious problem without telling them, because she didn't yet know herself. How serious? Haynes came on the intercom. His voice on the cabin recording is remarkable in its steadiness. He told the passengers that they had lost an engine, that they were diverting to Sioux City, that they expected to land in approximately 30 minutes. He told them the flight attendants would prepare them for the landing. He didn't lie to them. He didn't catastrophize. He gave them what information he could and returned to the problem. In the cockpit, the problem was becoming clearer and more frightening simultaneously. The aircraft was trapped in a phugoid, a slow oscillation, nose up, then nose down, altitude climbing and falling in a cycle of roughly 80 to 90 seconds. Each time the nose dropped, the aircraft descended. Each time it climbed, they gained a little back. But the overall trend was downward, and the phugoid was getting worse, not better. Fitch was fighting the throttles, trying to keep the oscillations manageable. Haynes and Records were trying every combination of inputs they could think of on the dead flight controls, hoping something had changed, that some residual hydraulic pressure had somehow accumulated, that the aircraft might give them back even a fraction of its steering authority. Nothing changed. Let me tell you about the moment, 40 minutes into the emergency, when they lined up for the runway. because what that moment looked like from the ground is something that witnesses have never forgotten. The air traffic controllers at Sioux Gateway Airport had cleared every other aircraft from the pattern. Emergency vehicles, fire trucks, ambulances, National Guard helicopters, every piece of rescue equipment Sioux City could assemble in 40 minutes were lined up along the runway. The airport's crash fire rescue team had been alerted. The local National Guard unit had been mobilized. Sioux City itself had mobilized. Hospitals cleared wards, blood banks prepared, off-duty emergency personnel drove to their stations without being called. Nobody who watched Flight 232 approach that runway expected anyone to walk away. The aircraft came in at approximately 240 knots, far too fast for a normal landing, which would be around 140. It was descending at 1,800 feet per minute, 4 times the normal rate. The nose was not perfectly aligned with the runway center line. The right wing was slightly low. The phugoid, which Fitch had been fighting for 40 minutes, picked exactly this moment to drive the nose down sharply one final time. The right wing struck the runway first. The right main landing gear collapsed. The right engine pod hit the ground and tore off. The aircraft, 182 tons of fully fueled DC-10, pivoted violently on the point of impact, the tail swinging right, the left wing rising, the fuselage beginning to rotate. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sequence in fractions of a second. Then it stopped. The aircraft broke apart. The tail section separated. The forward fuselage tumbled and came to rest inverted in a cornfield beside the runway. The center section, directly above the fuel tanks, caught fire immediately. The wreckage was spread across 3/4 of a mile. Of 296 people on board, 185 survived. Let me tell you what those numbers mean, because they're not what they appear to be at first reading. After the accident, the NTSB assembled the best DC-10 pilots in the United States, paired them with McDonnell Douglas engineers and United Airlines training specialists, and put them in the DC-10 simulator. They replicated the exact conditions of Flight 232. Total hydraulic failure, all 3 systems gone, only the throttles available. They asked these expert crews to do what Haynes, Records, Dvorak, and Fitch had done: get the aircraft to a runway and attempt a landing. Most of them never made it close to the ground under control. They crashed in the Iowa countryside miles from any airport. The ones who did reach the airport crashed on approach. A very small number managed to align with the runway, but came in too fast or too steep or with a wing too low. None of them produced a survivable outcome. The NTSB report concluded, in language that aviation professionals have quoted ever since, that the performance of the UAL Flight 232 flight crew was highly commendable and greatly exceeded reasonable expectations, and that the landing itself was, in the investigators' assessment, a highly random event, meaning what Haynes and Fitch and Records and Dvorak achieved was not reproducible. Not by expert pilots and simulators with full knowledge of exactly what they were facing. Not with practice, not with preparation, not with the benefit of knowing in advance what the aircraft was going to do. They had done something that was, by the NTSB's own finding, beyond what any training or skill could reliably produce. They had found a technique that didn't exist, applied it for 41 minutes under conditions that had never been survived, and delivered 185 people to the ground alive. Let me tell you about Captain Al Haynes in the years after the crash, because how he carried what happened tells you everything about who he was. Haynes did not retire to quiet. He spent the years after July 19th, 1989, doing something he was not required to do and received no compensation for. He talked about what happened. He spoke at flight safety conferences, at medical schools, at corporate management seminars, at aviation colleges. He talked about the decisions that were made that afternoon and, crucially, about the decisions he didn't make. He didn't try to land at Denver, which was farther, but where he had more familiarity. He trusted the controllers who vectored him to Sioux City. He didn't refuse Fitch's help out of professional pride. He didn't pretend to his crew or his passengers that things were better than they were. He didn't, in the final seconds before impact, take the controls back from Fitch because some instinct told him that if anyone was going to fly this aircraft into the ground, it should be him. Every one of those non-decisions, the things he chose not to do, mattered as much as the decisions he made. In his talks, Haynes frequently cited 4 reasons for the survival of 185 people that afternoon. He listed them in order: luck, the skills of the crew, the help of Dennis Fitch, and the crew resource management training that United Airlines have been implementing, which taught crews to use every available resource, every person, every piece of information, every capability on the aircraft, rather than concentrating authority at the top of the cockpit hierarchy. He put luck first. Every time, he never once implied that skill alone had produced the outcome. He was a man who understood exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant, and he spent the rest of his life making sure other people understood it too. Dennis Fitch went back to flying after the accident. He retired from United Airlines in 1993. He spent the following years speaking about Flight 232 and about CRM, the same circuit as Haynes, often alongside him. He was diagnosed with brain cancer in 2011. He died on May 7, 2012. He was 69 years old. Al Haynes attended his funeral. Haynes himself continued speaking about Flight 232 until his health prevented it. He died on August 25, 2019, 30 years and 37 days after the afternoon over Iowa. He was 87. Let me tell you about what Flight 232 changed, because the list is long and the changes run through every cockpit in commercial aviation today. The most immediate change was to the engine inspection program. The NTSB found that the hard alpha defect in the Stage 1 fan disc could have been detected by more sophisticated inspection methods, specifically by a process called enhanced ultrasonic inspection, which uses sound waves to detect internal material defects that visual inspection cannot find. General Electric and United Airlines had relied on inspection methods that weren't designed to find this type of defect at this location. After the accident, the FAA mandated enhanced inspection protocols for titanium rotating components in all commercial engines. Every fan disc, compressor disc, and turbine disc in commercial service was subject to new inspection requirements within specific flight cycle intervals. Those requirements exist today. Every time a commercial engine undergoes heavy maintenance, the rotating components are inspected using methods that Flight 232 made mandatory. The defect that destroyed engine number 2 of N1819, you could not reach the same size undetected in any modern commercial engine. That is the direct legacy of 112 people who didn't survive. The hydraulic system change was more complex. The NTSB acknowledged that the DC-10's triple redundant hydraulic system had been designed with the genuine belief that losing all 3 simultaneously was a 1 in a billion event. The accident proved that the routing of the hydraulic lines through the tail section created a vulnerability that the probability calculations hadn't fully captured. Subsequent aircraft designs, the Boeing 777, the Airbus A330, the 737 Next Generation series, incorporated lessons from Flight 232 in their hydraulic system routing and redundancy architecture. The lines are routed further apart through different structural zones, with additional separation between them. The crew resource management lessons from Flight 232 became, arguably, the most lasting change of all. CRM had existed as a concept before the accident. United Airlines had actually been one of its early implementers, which is part of why Haynes and his crew handled the situation the way they did. But Flight 232 gave CRM training a case study of such clarity and power that it transformed the way airlines train their crews worldwide. The image of a captain handing a passenger the throttles, of a 4-person improvised team managing an impossible situation through communication and shared authority, became the defining example of what CRM meant in practice. Today, every commercial pilot in the world receives CRM training. Every major airline conducts regular CRM evaluations in the simulator. The principle that the captain's authority is not absolute, that every crew member has not just the right, but the responsibility to speak up and contribute, that the best outcome comes from using every resource available. That principle has Flight 232 in its lineage more than any other single event. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is the thing Al Haynes said at the end of every talk he ever gave. He always ended the same way. He would describe the moment the aircraft stopped, the moment the cockpit voice recorder went silent, the moment he became aware that he had survived something that should not have been survivable. And then he would say something that, depending on who was in the audience, landed differently every time. He would say that 185 people were alive because of luck. And then he would pause. And then he would say, but the other 111 were not unlucky. They were sitting in the seats where the aircraft hit hardest, or above the fuel tanks where the fire reached first, or in locations where no amount of skill or preparation or luck could have changed the outcome. They were not unlucky. They were simply in the wrong place when a fan disc that had been cracking since 1971 finally let go. He said this because he didn't want the survival of 185 people to imply that the 112 who died had somehow failed to survive. They had not failed anything. The aircraft had failed them at a level so deep, a microscopic nitrogen inclusion in titanium manufactured 18 years earlier, that no one on board had any control over it. What the crew had controlled was everything they could control. The rest was physics. On a hillside beside the Sioux City runway, there is a memorial. It was built along the Missouri River to honor the crew of Flight 232 and the people of Sioux City who responded that afternoon. The emergency workers, the National Guard soldiers, the hospital staff, the ordinary residents who lined up to donate blood without being asked. The centerpiece of the memorial is a statue of Iowa National Guard Lieutenant Colonel Dennis Nielsen, taken from a photograph shot that afternoon. He is carrying a 3-year-old child away from the wreckage. The child is Sabrina Michelson, who survived. Her mother survived. Her father survived. They were in the right seats. That photograph, a soldier carrying a small child away from burning wreckage on a July afternoon in Iowa, was seen around the world the next day. It told the story that numbers could not tell as well, that the outcome of a flight that should have ended with 296 deaths on a runway in a Midwestern city, in a technique that expert pilots could not reproduce in a simulator, was also this. A child carried away from the fire. A captain who handed someone else the throttles. A 1,000,000-to-1 failure that proved the engineers wrong. In 41 minutes that aviation has been studying, teaching, and learning from ever since.